On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon walked into a television studio and told the American people he was protecting them from international speculators. He announced a temporary suspension of dollar convertibility to gold. Temporary. The word appears 3 times in his address. 53 years later, the suspension remains in place. The official story frames this as a decisive moment of American economic strength. Nixon took control. He defended the dollar. He outmaneuvered foreign governments attempting to drain American gold reserves. The documented record tells a different story. Nixon did not choose to close the gold window. He was forced to close it. Treasury records show the United States held 833 tons of gold against foreign dollar claims exceeding $60 billion. At the official exchange rate, foreign governments held legal rights to redeem more gold than America possessed. Britain had requested $3 billion in gold days before the announcement. Each. Treasury officials calculated the entire gold reserve would be depleted within weeks at the current redemption rate. Nixon did not protect the dollar. He defaulted on American obligations. He broke a promise made to every nation holding dollars since 1944. This distinction matters because the conditions producing the 1971 crisis did not disappear when Nixon closed the gold window. He removed the constraint. He did not remove the underlying imbalances. For 5 decades, those imbalances have compounded. The trade deficits triggering alarm in 1971 measured in single-digit billions. Today, they exceed $800 billion annually. The debt-to-GDP ratio in 1971 stood at 35%. Today, it exceeds 123%. Foreign central banks accumulated unwanted dollars before 1971. Today, they actively build infrastructure to avoid dollar dependence entirely. The machinery of the 1971 crisis is reassembling. The pressure points are the same. The leverage has shifted. Welcome to Rashi Historical. We follow the money, trace the power, and expose the history they never taught you in school. Your savings account, your retirement portfolio, your mortgage, and your purchasing power all depend on the dollar maintaining its role as the global reserve currency. This role was not earned through market competition. It was engineered at Bretton Woods in 1944, nearly destroyed by 1971, and rebuilt through a new arrangement with oil-producing nations. The system keeping the dollar dominant is not natural law. It is political architecture, and political architecture requires maintenance. The question facing you today is whether the current structure will hold, or whether you are living through the early stages of another 1971. The documented evidence suggests the latter. To understand why the dollar fell in 1971 and why the same dynamics threaten it today, you need to understand a structural flaw identified by economist Robert Triffin in 1960. Triffin testified before Congress with a warning so precise, so accurate in its predictions, that the problem now bears his name. The Triffin dilemma describes an impossible position. When a national currency serves as the global reserve currency, the world needs a constant supply of the currency to conduct international trade, hold reserves, and settle accounts. The only way to supply the world with dollars is for America to run persistent trade deficits. Dollars flow out of the country through imports, foreign investment, and military spending abroad. Foreign nations accumulate these dollars as reserves. The problem emerges over time. Persistent deficits mean persistent accumulation of claims against the issuing country. If the currency is backed by gold, foreign holders eventually accumulate claims exceeding the gold available to redeem them. Confidence erodes. Redemption requests accelerate. Crisis follows. Triffin predicted every stage of the 1971 crisis 11 years before it occurred. Congressional records document his testimony. He told lawmakers the system was mathematically unstable. He told them it would collapse. They did nothing. The Bretton Woods system established in 1944 made the dollar the centerpiece of global monetary architecture. 44 nations agreed to peg their currencies to the dollar. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. America promised to redeem dollars for gold on demand from foreign central banks. This promise made the dollar as good as gold for international transactions. The incentives were clear. Nations wanted dollars. Dollars provided liquidity. Dollars allowed trade with the largest economy in the world. Dollars could be exchanged for gold if needed. The system worked as long as confidence held. America exited World War II with an extraordinary position. The nation held over 20,000 metric tons of gold. This represented more than half of all monetary gold on the planet. Fort Knox held the treasure backing global commerce. American factories produced half of global industrial output. American farms fed Europe and Asia. The dollar was not merely a currency. It was the bottleneck through which global trade flowed. The first decade worked smoothly. Europe and Japan needed dollars to rebuild. They earned dollars through exports to America and received dollars through Marshall Plan aid and military spending. The dollar shortage of the late 1940s kept demand high and redemption pressure low. By the late 1950s, conditions shifted. European economies recovered. Japanese industry expanded. American competitiveness declined in relative terms. The dollar shortage became a dollar glut. Foreign central banks accumulated dollars faster than they could use them. Triffin saw the mathematics clearly. Every dollar deficit added to foreign claims. Every foreign claim represented a potential gold redemption. The gold stock was finite. The deficit process was continuous. The lines would cross. Between 1958 and 1965, documented gold flows confirmed the pattern. American gold reserves fell from over 20,000 tons to approximately 13,500 tons. Foreign central banks exchanged surplus dollars for gold shipments. The French were most aggressive, but Germany, Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland all participated. Treasury records show growing concern. Internal memos discuss the sustainability problem. The Kennedy administration attempted to address outflows through Operation Twist, interest equalization tax, and voluntary capital controls. These measures slowed the bleeding. They did not stop it. The structural flaw remained. America needed to run deficits to supply global liquidity. Deficits created redemption claims. Redemption claims drained gold. Gold drainage undermined confidence. Weakened confidence accelerated redemption requests. The system was consuming itself. Charles de Gaulle understood the arrangement better than most American officials cared to admit. In February 1965, de Gaulle held a press conference at the Élysée Palace and delivered a critique of American monetary privilege with precision and public documentation. De Gaulle described the dollar system as granting America an exorbitant privilege. The phrase has echoed through monetary debates for 6 decades. His analysis was straightforward. America could print dollars and exchange them for real goods, real services, and real assets around the world. Other nations had to earn their foreign exchange through exports, through labor, through production. America could create its international purchasing power with a printing press. Foreign nations accumulated paper claims. America accumulated the products of global industry. De Gaulle was not merely philosophizing. He was implementing policy. Acting on advice from economist Jacques Rueff, France began systematic conversion of dollar reserves to gold. French naval vessels carried gold bars from New York to Le Havre. The Banque de France documented every shipment. Between 1965 and 1967, France converted over $1.5 billion in dollar reserves to gold. The amounts seem small by today's standards. In context, they represented a direct challenge to American monetary authority. De Gaulle was calling the American bluff. Other nations watched closely. Germany held the largest dollar reserves outside the United States. The Bundesbank faced a choice: continue accumulating depreciating dollars or follow France's lead and demand gold. Political pressure from Washington kept Germany compliant. The U.S. military presence in Germany provided leverage beyond monetary policy. Britain faced a different version of the same problem. The pound sterling served as a secondary reserve currency. British deficits created pressure on both the pound and the dollar. In November 1967, Britain devalued the pound by 14%. The devaluation triggered a flight to gold. If Britain could devalue, America might follow. The London Gold Pool documented the response. Since 1961, 8 central banks had pooled gold resources to maintain the $35 per ounce official price. When private demand for gold surged, the pool sold into the market to suppress prices. The arrangement worked when pressure was moderate. After the British devaluation, pressure became unmanageable. In the first 3 months of 1968, the pool sold over 1,000 tons of gold. America provided 59% of the pool's resources. The gold drain accelerated beyond any sustainable pace. On March 15, 1968, the London gold market closed. It remained closed for 2 weeks. When it reopened, the system had changed fundamentally. The 8 nations announced a 2-tier gold market. Central banks would continue transacting at $35 per ounce among themselves. The private market would find its own price. The 2-tier system was a patch on a failing structure. It meant central banks would no longer defend the $35 price in private markets. Gold immediately traded higher in London. The gap between official and market prices represented the market's judgment on dollar credibility. For the next 3 years, the 2-tier system held through a combination of political pressure, German cooperation, and Japanese compliance. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. Foreign dollar holdings continued growing. Gold reserves continued shrinking. The mathematics Triffin identified a decade earlier moved toward their conclusion. The summer of 1971 brought the crisis to its breaking point. Treasury Undersecretary Paul Volcker, who would later become Federal Reserve Chairman, documented the final months in detail. His account confirms the desperation inside the Nixon administration. British representatives approached the Treasury in early August 1971 with a request to convert $3 billion in dollar holdings to gold. The request was legal under Bretton Woods agreements. It was also impossible to fulfill at the current pace without depleting remaining reserves. Volcker calculated the timeline. At current redemption rates, America would exhaust its gold reserves within months. Other nations watched British actions. If Britain received gold, France would demand more. Germany and Japan would face pressure to convert holdings rather than absorb losses from dollar devaluation. A bank run was forming. The bank was the United States Treasury. The depositors were sovereign nations. Nixon convened a secret meeting at Camp David on August 13th. 1971, the participants included Treasury Secretary John Connally, Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, Volcker, and economic advisors Herbert Stein and George Shultz. The meeting lasted through the weekend. Transcripts and recordings document the deliberations. Connally dominated the discussions, a Texan with political instincts sharper than his economic training. Connally saw the gold window closure as an opportunity rather than a defeat. He framed the action in nationalist terms. America was being exploited by foreign speculators. The president would take decisive action. Burns objected. The Federal Reserve Chairman warned about inflation and international consequences. He proposed alternatives, including capital controls and interest rate increases. Connally dismissed the objections. Burns had political vulnerabilities. Nixon had pressured him on monetary policy before. Burns fell in line. The decision was made. America would close the gold window. Nixon would announce the action on Sunday evening, August 15th, before markets opened Monday morning. The announcement included additional measures: a 90-day wage and price freeze to control inflation, a 10% import surcharge to pressure trading partners. The full package was called the New Economic Policy. Nixon's televised address presented the gold window suspension as a defensive measure against speculators. The text made no reference to American deficits causing the crisis. It made no reference to Vietnam War spending straining finances. It blamed foreign forces attacking the dollar. The immediate international reaction was chaos. Currency markets closed across Europe. Finance ministers scrambled to coordinate responses. The International Monetary Fund had no contingency plan. The Bretton Woods system, which had structured global finance for 27 years, ended in a single weekend television broadcast. The Smithsonian Agreement in December 1971 attempted to establish new fixed exchange rates. The dollar was devalued against gold to $38 per ounce. Other currencies appreciated against the dollar. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in world history. It lasted 14 months. By February 1973, the system collapsed entirely. The dollar was devalued again to $42.22 per ounce. By March 1973, all major currencies floated against each other. The fixed exchange rate system Bretton Woods established was dead. The temporary suspension of gold convertibility became permanent. The constraint was gone. What followed was a 50-year experiment in purely fiat money managed by central banks without external discipline. The patterns preceding the 1971 crisis are reassembling in documented form. Each major indicator showing stress before Nixon's announcement has a contemporary parallel with larger magnitude. Trade deficits triggered the original crisis. America ran its first modern trade deficit in 1971. The deficit measured approximately $2.3 billion. Treasury officials treated it as an emergency requiring immediate structural response. Contemporary data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis shows America has run trade deficits for 47 consecutive years since 1976. The 2023 deficit reached $773 billion. Adjusting for inflation, the current deficit is 30 times larger than the figure causing alarm in 1971. The response is silence. Deficits of this magnitude are treated as normal operating conditions. The flow of dollars abroad continues accelerating. Foreign nations accumulate claims against American assets. The mechanism Triffin identified remains operative. The constraint of gold convertibility is gone, but the accumulation of foreign claims continues. Foreign dollar reserves built up before 1971 because nations wanted dollar liquidity. Today, foreign dollar reserves are declining as a percentage of total reserves because nations want diversification. International Monetary Fund data tracks reserve currency composition through its COFIR database. In 2001, dollars represented 73% of allocated foreign exchange reserves. By 2024, the share fell to 58%. The decline represents over $3 trillion in reduced dollar preference. Central banks are not selling dollars for other fiat currencies. They are buying gold. World Gold Council data documents a surge in central bank gold purchases beginning in 2022. Central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in both 2022 and 2023. This represents the highest sustained purchasing rate since before 1971, when central banks were redeeming dollars for gold from the U.S. Treasury. The buyers are concentrated among nations seeking reduced dollar dependence. China's central bank has added gold reserves in 18 consecutive months through early 2024. Russia accumulated over 2,000 tons before sanctions froze reporting. India, Turkey, Poland, Czech Republic, and Singapore are documented buyers. The pattern inverts the 1971 dynamic. Before Nixon's announcement, gold flowed from America to foreign central banks exercising redemption rights. Today, gold flows from Western bullion markets to Eastern central bank vaults. The direction differs. The motivation is identical. Foreign holders are positioning for dollar uncertainty. Debt levels amplify the structural stress. In 1971, federal debt totaled approximately $400 billion against GDP of $1.1 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio stood at 35%. Today, federal debt exceeds $34 trillion against GDP of approximately $28 trillion. The ratio exceeds 123%. Interest payments on federal debt reached $1 trillion in 2024. This amount exceeds the entire defense budget. It exceeds all non-defense discretionary spending combined. The Treasury must borrow money to pay interest on previous borrowing. Foreign participation in Treasury auctions shows documented decline. In 2008, foreign buyers purchased 50% of Treasury securities. By 2024, foreign participation fell below 30%. The Federal Reserve and domestic institutions absorb the difference. The demand base for dollar-denominated debt is contracting precisely when supply is expanding. Monetary policy parallels strengthen the comparison. Federal Reserve archives document the political pressure on Arthur Burns before 1971. Nixon wanted accommodative policy to support his re-election. Burns complied despite inflation concerns. The Fed's balance sheet tells the contemporary story. In August 2007, the Federal Reserve held $870 billion in assets. By October 2024, holdings exceeded $7 trillion. The eightfold expansion occurred through quantitative easing programs, purchasing Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities with newly created dollars. Money supply data quantifies the creation. M2 money supply measured $4.8 trillion in 2000. By 2024, M2 exceeded $21 trillion. The dollar lost over 95% of its purchasing power since 1971. A dollar in 1971 purchased goods requiring over $7.50 today. The international response to 1971 was ultimately accommodation. European nations and Japan accepted dollar devaluation and floating exchange rates because they had no alternative architecture. American military protection mattered more than monetary grievances. The dollar system continued because replacing it was impractical. Contemporary foreign responses include infrastructure development absent in 1971. China launched the cross-border interbank payment system in 2015 as an alternative to SWIFT. Transaction volume grows annually. Russia, Iran, and sanctioned nations use CEPs to conduct trade outside dollar clearing systems. The mBridge project connects central bank digital currencies across China, Thailand, UAE, Hong Kong, and Saudi Arabia. The Bank for International Settlements coordinates the pilot program. Documentation shows transaction testing for oil purchases settled in digital yuan rather than dollars. BRICS nations announced dedicated working groups on de-dollarization at their 2023 and 2024 summits. Brazil and China signed direct currency swap agreements bypassing dollar conversion. Russia and India settled oil purchases in rupees and rubles. These initiatives remain small relative to dollar dominance. SWIFT data shows dollars still represent 47% of international payment transactions. The euro follows at 23%. Chinese yuan represents under 5%. The trend line matters more than the current level. Infrastructure for dollar alternatives is being constructed. Incentives favor diversification for nations facing sanctions risk. The network effects supporting dollar dominance erode incrementally. American financial sanctions accelerate the process. Since 2014, the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has expanded sanctions programs against Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and Chinese entities. Freezing Russian central bank reserves in 2022 sent a specific message to every foreign government holding dollar assets. Dollar reserves are not neutral stores of value. They are contingent on American political approval. Any nation facing potential American opposition has documented incentive to reduce dollar exposure. The list of such nations has expanded significantly. The 1971 crisis reached its climax through a specific mechanism. Foreign central banks exercised legal rights to convert dollars to gold. The redemption right provided the pressure point. When Britain requested $3 billion in gold, the request triggered Nixon's response. The contemporary system has no equivalent formal redemption right. Dollars are not convertible to gold at any official rate. Foreign holders cannot force the Treasury to exchange paper for metal. The pressure points today are different but equally concrete. The Treasury must refinance existing debt and issue new debt continuously. In 2024, approximately $9 trillion in Treasury securities mature and require refinancing. Each auction requires buyers willing to hold dollar-denominated debt at offered interest rates. If foreign buyers reduce participation, domestic buyers must absorb more. If domestic demand falters, the Federal Reserve becomes buyer of last resort. Fed purchases mean money creation. Money creation means inflation pressure. Inflation erodes the value of all existing dollar-denominated assets. The feedback loop is visible. Higher inflation requires higher interest rates to attract buyers. Higher interest rates increase interest payments on debt. Higher interest payments require more borrowing. More borrowing increases supply of Treasury securities. More supply requires either more demand or higher rates to clear markets. This cycle operated in contained form since 2008. The Fed suppressed interest rates through quantitative easing. Low rates kept interest payments manageable despite rising debt. The 2021-2023 inflation surge ended rate suppression. The Fed raised rates to 5.25%. Interest payments exploded. The Congressional Budget Office projects. Interest payments will consume 22% of federal revenue by 2034 under current policy. This projection assumes no recession, no new spending programs, and no additional rate increases. Any deviation worsens the trajectory. Energy markets provide another pressure point. The petrodollar arrangement following 1971 tied global oil sales to dollar denomination. Saudi Arabia agreed to price oil in dollars and invest surplus revenues in Treasury securities. In exchange, America provided military protection. This arrangement kept dollar demand high, regardless of American economic performance. Every nation buying oil needed dollars. Every oil exporter recycled dollars back to American financial markets. Saudi Arabia signed agreements with China for yuan-denominated oil sales in 2023. The volumes remain small. The precedent matters more than the current flow. Saudi Arabia is diversifying its own reserves away from exclusive dollar holdings. The kingdom joined BRICS in 2024. The structural concentration of dollar dominance creates its own vulnerability. When 58% of global reserves are held in one currency, any significant reallocation moves markets. Central banks coordinate quietly to avoid triggering the instability they fear. The coordination has limits. Each central bank faces its own domestic pressures. Each finance ministry answers to its own political leadership. The incentive to exit early before others exceeds the incentive to coordinate a gradual transition. The bank run dynamic familiar from 1971 applies to institutions rather than individuals. The dollar will not lose reserve status overnight. The 1971 crisis built for 13 years before Nixon's announcement. The current stress indicators have accumulated for over a decade. The timeline for resolution remains uncertain. What is certain is the direction. The documented indicators all point toward reduced dollar centrality in global finance. Trade deficits continue. Debt accumulates. Foreign diversification accelerates. Alternative infrastructure expands. Sanctions create incentives for workarounds. The 1971 resolution came through American unilateral action. Nixon closed the gold window because he had no alternative. The constraints forced his hand. He chose the timing and framing. He could not choose whether to act. A similar dynamic appears today. The constraints are tightening. Debt levels, interest costs, and foreign diversification all reduce American freedom of action. At some point, the constraints will force a response. The form of the response remains open. The necessity of response becomes clearer with each passing quarter. Monetary resets favor those positioned in advance. The wealthy understood this before 1971. They held gold while Nixon told ordinary citizens to trust the dollar. When the window closed and gold prices surged from $35 to $850 by 1980, wealth transferred from those holding dollars to those holding gold. Your position in the next transition depends on understanding the pressures building today. The documented record of 1971 provides the template. The contemporary data provides the warning. History does not repeat in precise form. The patterns of monetary crisis have documented consistency across centuries and continents. Governments facing unsustainable debts, declining foreign confidence, and rising domestic inflation eventually devalue. The devaluation takes purchasing power from those holding the currency. It transfers value to those holding real assets. The question is not whether the dollar faces structural pressure. The documented evidence is conclusive. The question is how you respond to documented evidence pointing toward monetary instability. Every central bank adding gold to reserves has made a decision about the dollar's future. Every nation building alternative payment infrastructure has made a decision. Every finance ministry reducing Treasury holdings has made a decision. The decisions multiply, the infrastructure expands, the pressure builds. August 1971 taught one lesson above all others. When the constraint becomes unbearable, governments act without warning. Nixon's announcement came on a Sunday evening specifically to prevent markets from reacting before implementation. Those who understood the pressure in advance had time to prepare. Those who trusted official assurances faced Monday morning with portfolios worth less than Friday afternoon. The documented record exists for your analysis. The contemporary parallels exist for your interpretation. The decisions about your own positioning remain yours to make. 53 years ago, a temporary suspension became permanent policy. The word temporary appeared in official statements until the gap between language and reality became too obvious to maintain. Today, the word sustainable appears in discussions of debt, deficits, and dollar dominance. The gap between language and reality grows wider each quarter.